morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here for this discussion about planned relocation. When we think about climate change, it sometimes feels so profoundly overwhelming that it's very hard to know where to begin and how you can possibly address it, because it just feels so overwhelming. By 2050, more than 1 billion people in low-lying, on small islands in low-lying areas near the sea are going to be in danger of being displaced. 1 billion people. What we would like to do in an ideal world would be to prevent 1 billion people from being displaced by 2050. And yet, we find ourselves at Human Rights Watch knowing that that is likely not possible and having to look at actually planning to move, to leave low-lying areas. So I think I would like to start off by just asking why, of all the things, of all of the rights that are threatened by the climate crisis, why has Human Rights Watch decided to focus on planned displacement?
Hello? Yes.
There you go.
It's a sobering question and a sobering place to start. I think climate displacement is the most human angle of this climate crisis. It's about people's lives and their livelihoods, their sense of home, the place they belong. It's about identity in a changing world. When I first started working on climate mobility back in 2013, over a decade ago, it felt like this future hypothetical in some faraway place. But today we see that it's truly a global and a current reality. According to data that was published just last week by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is the most authoritative source of data in this space, 48.5 million people were displaced by disasters in the year 2024 alone. Most of those disasters are floods, storms, hazards that we know are becoming more intense and frequent because of the climate crisis. This data is increasing. It shows there's a trend over time. This year, 48.5 million people, that's more than 2 times the annual average of the number of people displaced annually over the last decade. Facing that sobering reality, communities and governments are exploring approaches to reduce risks and adapt, to prevent the high social, cultural, human rights harms of climate displacement. One very unique adaptation approach in that toolkit of building seawalls and raising homes on stilts, one way that communities can adapt is the planned relocation of entire communities out of harm's way. And this has become the focus of our work at Human Rights Watch. It's usually thought of as a measure of last resort. It's never the first thing a community wants, but it's happening. Before I came to Human Rights Watch, I led a global mapping exercise where we identified over 400 communities around the world that have already moved collectively to new sites out of harm's way. And this is likely to happen more as the climate crisis accelerates. Every country with a coastline will need to take this issue extremely seriously in the decades to come, and human rights-based approaches are sorely needed. Planning relocations that are community-wide is intensely human. It's about so much more than just building new homes. It's about moving schools, moving hospitals, ensuring that people's cultures are protected. It's about listening to communities and making sure that their needs are front and center and their rights are protected. And that's HRW's bread and butter. There are huge consequences when we don't approach climate adaptation solutions with human rights-based approaches front and center.
I can just add, like, we have one of the biggest experts on the team around the world, so, but I can just add a line that you still could be wondering why we, from everything that we could be doing on the climate adaptation space, why we chose climate displacement and planned relocation. And I just want to remind, if you don't know, that Human Rights Watch went through a long process of planning of a global strategy in which we wanted to tackle the most serious human rights violation around the world and also check where we could add value. And what we realized doing this exercise was that there are a lot of other organizations working on climate adaptation issues. They are working on, as Erica raised, building sea level, sea walls, checking on climate finance, where money is going or not going, and early warning signs and precautions that people should take to adapt. And we realized that no other global human rights organization was working on the human rights impacts of climate displacement. And knowing that this is something that is only going to grow, as Erica said, in intensity, complexity, as the climate crisis accelerates. So we decided to take on this work, and the fact that no one is immune to it. Like climate mobility is happening in all inhabited continents in the world. Like we are facing that everywhere. And even as Erica has pointed out in your first session, it has become a conversation that we who live near to coast start to have with our relatives, what we are going to do if we need to move. But as we also know by experience, evidence, everyone is affected, but there are people who are more affected. So marginalized community around the world are the ones who are facing trauma of climate displacement. So who are these marginalized people? We know who they are also. They are usually indigenous people living in small island developing countries. They are other people living in least developed countries who least contributed to the climate crisis. They are women. They are people with disability who are usually the last one to be even rescued in situations that are traumatizing on the climate and other issues. And I'm very happy to see Elizabeth here because DRD is actually leading work in the Philippines, like documenting the impact of climate displacement for people with disabilities. So we are helping each other on that, and we are happy to make it a Human Rights Watch issue for everyone to work, us in the Environment Division, but taking the expertise of our colleagues in different thematic divisions to help us advance on the advocacy, which is every coast, a country with a coastline should have a protocol to have a right-respecting planned relocation project scheme protocol.
As you're speaking, I mean, there are coastal communities and there are coastal communities, and I'm thinking my family owns a house in the Outer Banks, which is a barrier island. It's on stilts, and the coastline is slowly encroaching and houses are washing out to sea. And what do we do about it? We raise taxes, and a certain percentage of the taxes go towards what's called beach nourishment. And every few years we fight the ocean and we pump a bunch of sand from out to sea back onto shore and create more beach and build artificial dunes to protect the houses. Like, these are things that we can do, and most of these are vacation homes anyway. And so we're not going to be, if they wash out to sea, it's very sad, but it's not going to destroy a culture and a lifestyle. When you have indigenous communities that don't have the advantages of being able to raise taxes and build a wall or build dunes or create new beach, like, how do you even go about relocating an entire community? How does that happen?
What a question. I think the best way to answer is for you to hear from some indigenous community leaders themselves. This is my friend, Blas Lopez. Can you press the video, please?
Pueblo cuna, en caso de Cartí, estamos hace más de 100 años que estamos en las costas de Cunayala. El conocimiento ancestral en tema de cambio climático puede aportar mucho ese conocimiento a través de su experiencia, de sus conocimientos, saberes ancestrales del pueblo cuna.
Nosotros vamos a dejar la isla y tratar de movernos a tierra firme, ya que las circunstancias así lo ameritan. Nosotros lo hacemos por hacinamiento, ya que en la isla tenemos ya el censo es muy grande y muchas familias están viviendo hacinadas. Y por esa razón, esa fue nuestra prioridad para cruzar a la isla que está al frente, a la tierra firme. Casi el 50% de ese es el problema que tenemos en la isla, que es la falta de vivienda, la falta de dónde depositar nuestra basura y también tenemos el problema del agua. De verdad que el cambio climático se está acentuando cada año más.
El proyecto de la barriada es la iniciativa del pueblo de la comunidad de Cartí Suyo, ¿no? Y es un proyecto ambicioso. Por ejemplo, esa iniciativa de la comunidad Cartí de trasladarse a una comunidad es un ejemplo y puede ser un modelo, pero claro, falta mucho la planificación, y tanto del gobierno, tanto digamos, de la misma comunidad.
Sí, ha sido una esperanza muy grande, casi 13 años de lucha, 13 años de trabajos. Muchas de las personas que empezaron limpiando el terreno, buscando el lugar ideal, han muerto, pero todavía quedamos. Y nuestros hijos, por eso es una alegría que nuestros hijos, nuestros nietos puedan verlo nuevamente. Y también es nuestra alegría ser los primeros, porque así otras comunidades que tienen que surgir, que irse a tierra firme, van a tener un modelo y van a poder mejorar la imagen que nosotros tenemos de Isperiala, porque ahora sí van a poder luchar, van a poder exigir lo que desean.
As you can see on this slide, the Gardi Sagdab community lived on an island that was the size of 5 football fields, and yet there were almost 15,000 people living there. And sea level rise was meaning that this island became smaller year after year, and floods were coming into these homes. So I'd heard about these challenges, and it wasn't until I spoke to Blas Lopez, who you saw on the screen, a community leader, and after weeks of planning and anticipation, visited this community, that I really understood what that actually meant in practice. Sea level rise is threatening people's rights to an adequate standard of living, to health, to education. I heard stories about all of this, but what was most striking to me is when I first approached this island by boat, the school, which you can see in the northern corner, is literally falling into the sea. The title of this report is "The Sea is Eating the Land Beneath Our Homes and School" for a reason. And that was a direct quote from a young woman in the community. When I spoke to people on this island, it was so obvious how deeply they loved their home. No one wanted to leave. But after decades of floods and knowing that sea level rise will make matters worse over time, this community started to grapple with those inevitable realities. This is a community of sociologists and biologists and planners and activists, people who are taking their future incredibly seriously. They were dreaming of what a better future for future generations looks like. They were asking questions that, as Maria Laura mentioned, are soon going to be familiar dinner table conversations for many of us. Can we stay here? Do we have to move? If so, when, where, and how? In 2010, they chose this measure of last resort to plan a relocation of their entire community and culture to the mainland. This is a costly, traumatic, and complex process. It's about so much more than housing. It's about schools and cultures and healthcare. It's about cultural heritage and identity. So to make this move with dignity, they needed help. They wanted support from their government. And the Panamanian government made commitments to provide support for them. But over a decade, promise after promise after promise was broken. One community elder who I spoke to told me that many of the minds who had first conceptualized this project had already passed away, and he wondered if he would even be alive to see this dream come to fruition. So that's where we came in. I worked very closely with Blas and Magdalena, who you saw in that video, and with other community leaders to write a report documenting how sea level rise and floods was already threatening people's rights. Our goal here was to document some of the issues around lack of consultation and delays in following up with support. This is one of those situations where things had lingered for decades, and Human Rights Watch's report was a real catalyst. It was a chance to pass the megaphone to this community and to make some real noise. I'm proud to share that thanks in part to our work, there were at least 3 concrete wins in the past year for this community. First, in the immediate aftermath of our report launch, the community was consulted for the first time in a very long time. The Vice Minister of Housing visited this community herself to understand what their biggest concerns were about this move. Second, they followed through on a promise to build cultural heritage centers in the traditional Guna style in the new site. This meant that culture and heritage was centered in this planned relocation process, which is a huge priority for Indigenous communities, as I'm sure we all can imagine. And finally, in June 2024, my phone erupted. I had so many WhatsApp messages and photographs from this community sharing the great news, which was that they had finally been able to move to this new site. 300 families had finally moved to safety. This is a dream that the community had been working towards for over a decade, and it had been achieved, which was a major win. Very unfortunately, and frankly quite tragically, just days after the new site opened, Blas Lopez, who you've just met on the screen, passed away. And it was devastating. I mean, he was such a figurehead in this community, and he was really the driving force of this relocation process, and was able to make connections and forge relationships with government leaders, with researchers from around the world. He was such a force of nature. He was really the reason why this dream was achieved. And in the immediate aftermath, we were able to share a version of this video and bring some of the human rights principles that he stood for. For example, the right of Indigenous communities to self-determination in their climate adaptation processes, front and center at a Human Rights Council side event in Geneva. It was a very small testament to the incredible work that Blas had done over many, many, many years. Gardi Sogdeb is not alone, and it's important that the lessons from Blas's work are carried forwards. Dozens of communities in Panama are facing similar challenges, and the government needs to develop a policy to protect the rights of indigenous communities who are planning these incredibly challenging relocation processes. And also, their voices need to be front and center in that policy development process. I can share some more good news, which is that the former president committed to developing a policy on planned relocation as climate adaptation. And they reached out to us to ask for the names of some indigenous leaders who they could invite to those policy discussions. But then, as seems to happen everywhere around the world, a new administration was elected. And that has both tremendous challenges for continuing our advocacy work, but also some opportunities.
Maria Laura, I know that you recently went to Panama to do some advocacy around planned relocation. I wonder if you can talk to us about how that went.
Yes, no, sure. Yes, I was on my way back from Brazil, where I had released the World Report of Human Rights Watch, and I said, why not stop in Panama and see how things are going there? And I had the fortunate to meet not Blas, although I have heard a lot about him, but Elliot. Elliot is a young biologist who became one of the most important leaders of the Gard-Sagdab community, and he's fantastic. Like, his challenge right now is to make sure that the children in the new site don't get away from the traditions of the community. So he's doing everything he can to make sure that they understand what it was to live on the island, what it is to be a traditional indigenous important community in the new site. Of course, he is also struggling with many things that they still need to do. For instance, the water access is not that good yet, sanitation, sewage system. So we work a lot together to find potential donors, even to make sure that the new site has like water access to the community. And so it was brilliant. Like the highlight of the mission to Panama was actually meeting Elliot and see that he's doing the work that Blas used to do before. So it's interesting, like how the issue of new generation play on the field of climate action, because it is something that we used to say and hear that we do for the future generation. And Elliot is Blas' future generation, and he's doing the work brilliantly. So in addition to meeting him, I had the opportunity also to meet the new climate envoy of Panama. He has a big mission. Like, he's a young, a very enthusiastic, energetic man as well, and he received me with a lot of, like, giving a lot of importance. Like, he called all his advisors to meet me. It was me plus like 5 people doing different work, and he at that time showed that they were still committed to the community of Gard-Sagdab, but also 40 other communities in Panama that are also in a situation that they have to plan relocation. They will have to be displaced soon. So he invited us to be part of a consultation process on a new decree that is going to establish the foundation, the legal foundation for the national protocol on planned relocation. He said and he showed that there is commitment to consult the organizations. He comes from civil society, and he knew all these indigenous leaders, and they committed to do so. And so it was overwhelming and really good to see that they received, that they knew about Human Rights Watch. Of course, they knew about Erica's report. They were ready to respond, and they were actually putting in place a practical a timeline to meet the recommendations. There are more recommendations there. Of course, the new site cannot be abandoned there is a lot of support need by the government of Panama, but it was good to see that they're working on. Like, we submitted we made our submission to this process, advocating for, of course, more human rights protections and standards, including the right to free, prior, and full consultation with indigenous communities, which was not so clear in the process of, like, it's the consultation to the consultation. So we made clear that that was like part of their obligations, and they seem to understand that.
So it's kind of an amazing story, actually. I know the process was flawed, right? The Panamanian government broke a lot of promises, but you had this community that realized they were in danger, took their own initiative to want to move, got help from the government. The government might have dragged its feet for a while, but is seemingly willing now to engage, and it is basically a success story, right? With an asterisk, okay? But that's not always the case. It's sometimes communities don't want to move, right? Sometimes they're forced to move. Can you tell us about one of those examples of forced relocation that was not community driven?
Yes, I can start, and Erica can continue because she has just come back from a mission to Senegal. So this is we heard from her the context in which community want to move, and they lead the efforts to move in a rights-respecting way. But we thought we would have add value as well, addressing the context in which governments lead the relocation. Many times they lead relocation saying that it's for protecting people from climate, sea level rise, and the climate disaster, but sometimes they use that as a narrative, but in the end what they want is to do economic development projects. And so we are wanting to look at this context and really, really hold accountable governments that have been using narratives. In the case of Senegal, we went to St. Louis. St. Louis is in the coast. It's like a 20 kilometers line on the coast. It's where there is a very important fishing cultural component of the community, like people survive, and it's like a lifestyle also, like a culture to be fisher folks. But of course, recently, and not recently, for some time now, they have been hit by floods, by the effects of sea level rise. So the government is planning to relocate 15,000 people from the coast to a new site that they have built 10 kilometers from the coast, which is that one in the corner there. But the problem is, so in this case, different from Gardsagda, the government has been involved since the beginning. Of course, a lot of people, like many of the communities, want to stay, but they will have to move. The government has gotten a lot of money from the World Bank to do this move. However, the problem is that a lot of people, many families were left out from the plan. So, and they have stuck in Ayala in the middle, which is a temporary camp that it wasn't even built for them. It was built in a different context. It's very dry. It's far from the coast. As I said, 95% of the community survive from fishing. That's their livelihoods. And they have to travel to go to the sea. And the problem is that when they travel, they don't even have transport to go. So they have been spending more money with transportation than what they get daily from the fishing. So this is what happened when you leave. Like, first you don't consult them of what they want, what their future look like in their view, and also when you don't respect the conditions. The conditions in the new site that Erica will talk a little bit more about it are horrible. Like, there is overcrowding. There are houses in which there is one bathroom for around 28 to 35 people. They don't have sanitation. They don't have like a sewage system or sanitation, and it's been very hard for them to be there. But they have been stuck there for more than 10 years. So our purpose is to look at this and, of course, document the human rights violations and advocate with the government of Senegal, but also the global international community who has influence on it to make sure that this other relocation also doesn't happen the same way. But I think Erica can talk a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Maria Laura. Now okay, we'll stay on this slide. There are clear human rights violations here in this context, specifically to the right to adequate housing. There is inadequate conditions, it's uninhabitable, there is 30 people in a house, and sometime I visited one house where there were about 30 people, 3 goats, and 5 chickens, all sharing 3 bedrooms and 1 living space. In addition, they have insecure tenure. They have temporary occupancy permits, but everyone believes, and the government believes, they're squatters. So they actually have had all of their attempts to pursue their own durable solutions, to rebuild their houses, or to create livelihoods training programs. All of those efforts have been systematically stopped by the local municipality. They have no ability to pursue their own solutions, and they've also been left out of the government-led solutions. But I want to tell you the story of Hadi, who is not going to appear on screen, but I want you to imagine a 26-year-old woman who I had the chance to meet just a few weeks ago. She was 17 years old when the devastating floods came to the coast. Her house was completely destroyed. All of the cement bricks fell from the ceiling. Her family members became disabled. She was no longer able to stay in that home because it did not exist. They moved to tents. They were in a temporary site for a few months. Eventually, her mother led a protest to the mayor's office to say, look, you can't leave us in these tents. We need some type of solution. And eventually, that mayor said, okay, you can have these temporary permits to stay in that other site, Haryala. When she got there, her sister, who had pre-existing medical challenges, she passed away, and that, unfortunately, was partially the result because she could no longer access the medical care that she could when she lived at the coast. In addition, they had to use the very limited support that the government provided them to pay for the funeral of her sister. She also had to stop school because this new site is so far away from her old school. But still, she became the de facto community leader and advocate, despite being in her mid-20s. She has led the Women's Association, she has led efforts to build a new women's center, and she's really the one leading the charge for this community to advocate for their rights and their protection, and possibly even their inclusion in the new planned relocation site supported by the World Bank in Jogob. Their first choice is to move back to the coast, obviously. But there's no more land. And now they just want any kind of durable solution. She told me, all I want is just to live a life with dignity.
These 2 case studies that we've looked at, one, in St. Louis, where it was the government forced them to relocate. They ended up in a tent city. They didn't provide much assistance. Versus Panama, where we had a community-led effort that worked with the government. Why did you focus on these 2? Are there other ones? Are these representative of what will happen in other places? Why St. Louis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, they're quite different contexts, drastically so. We chose to focus on San Luis because this is a massive scale urban relocation. 15,000 people. This illustrates the challenges that occur when you take a massive city and you try to move that many people away from the coast. We see that more and more countries like Senegal that are very exposed to the climate crisis will start facing these challenges. And we chose Senegal because we see it as a context where the government is somewhat receptive to human rights-based advocacy and a setting where we can really push the government, like Panama, to start taking these issues very seriously and developing a rights-respecting national policy to guide future relocations. We were also drawn to this case study because of the outsized role that the World Bank played. International financial institutions are getting more and more involved in these kinds of climate-related relocations. And of course, development banks have pretty horrifying track records when it comes to development displacement. Think of the Three Gorges Dam in China, for example, though that wasn't necessarily led by the World Bank. Think about Human Rights Watch has done incredible reporting about World Bank-funded dams in Tajikistan and the massive displacement that was very forced that occurred in that context. But right now, the World Bank is copying and pasting their same template from development displacement and pasting it on this climate-related scenario. And they're fundamentally different. If your goal is to relocate people to protect them from climate change hazards, protection needs to be front and center. Consultation needs to be front and center. You need to make sure that these new destination sites protect their livelihoods and their cultures. And that's not currently happening in the World Bank's template. So we're using this particular case study as a chance to open a world of advocacy with international financial institutions to help hold them accountable in this new climate-related relocation setting.
Thanks. Is the effort to, so we work with the World Bank, I assume our advocacy targets are the World Bank, like create a blueprint for how to do this. Are we also trying to create a blueprint for governments, for states that have large coastal communities?
Indeed, and that's really the focus of this work with the Senegalese government and also with the Panamanian government. As I mentioned earlier, every country with a coastline is going to need to take this challenge extremely seriously and develop national policies that safeguard communities' rights in these processes and make sure that consultation happens front and center. Make sure that there is an adequate census that's conducted and people like Hadi's family are not left out of the solutions.
Maybe I could just ask a final question before we go to the Q&A. When we were prepping for this session, one of the things I asked you about that I found so painful and maybe not so surprising is that it seems so many of the communities that are affected are indigenous communities. And I wondered, why is that? Are indigenous communities, did they choose locations that are just more affected by rising sea levels? Were they pushed there? Do they not have access to the kind of mitigation measures that would protect the communities? Why are so many of them indigenous communities?
I mean, this is an extraordinarily complex question. Every indigenous community is unique. Every location is unique. But we do see some trends at a global scale. We see that communities that have been marginalized historically are often most exposed to the climate crisis today. So for example, in Gardi Sugdub, this is a community that was forced to live on that island off the coastline because of settler colonialism. Because when the Spanish colonists arrived in this area, they told them they were no longer able to wear their Guna traditional dress, they were no longer able to speak their languages, they had to go to certain schools, and they fled to that island because it was a place they could be safe and retain their culture. In the United States, Ile de Jean Charles is a community off the coast of Louisiana. They moved to that island and now have had to relocate to the mainland because of the climate crisis. But the reason they lived in that extremely vulnerable location was because of the Trail of Tears. It's because, again, we see that these communities are being forced to live in areas that today are exposed to the climate crisis because of forces like colonialism. So I don't think we can look at these communities' predicaments or the obligations that governments have to protect them in isolation. You have to think about historical context and specifically the colonial dimensions.
I wonder if anybody in the audience has any questions that they would like to pose to Erica or Maria Laura. Kimberly?
Oh. Hi. Thank you so much. It's such an interesting topic and a new one. Having been involved with Human Rights Watch for 21 years, it's like always for me fascinating to hear about, you know, the incredible research and focus of an evolving crisis that is impacting, as often the most marginalized communities. I'm just wondering, so I loved hearing how you're using these case studies to think bigger, and obviously you're working with our economic justice people to address and do advocacy with some of the financial institutions. Are you thinking at all in an even like bigger way, you know, treaties, compacts between states? Talk about that. I'd love to hear what this like kind of longer term vision is.
Thank you. That's the best question. I think you were a plant. No, I'm just joking. Absolutely, right? This is an enormous challenge. Over 400 communities around the world. The community of Walande that you might have seen in the virtual reality project, I hope you all had the chance to visit. Gardi Sugdub, San Luis, these communities are not alone. There are so many communities around the world that are facing the same challenges, and we need to scale up this work. So, as we've already mentioned, one of our big advocacy goals is that every country with a coastline starts a national conversation. We already have international toolkits. We already have international guidance that enshrines human rights principles in this context. Back in 2015, I was involved in putting that first guidance document together when I was working at UNHCR. That guidance exists, and yet it's not being implemented. Governments aren't developing their national policies. So now we're really excited to be launching a global coalition of relocating community leaders, the CSOs, the researchers that are working very closely with those communities, to come together and to work towards that goal of every country with a coastline developing a national policy. In June of this year, in New York City, on the margins of a conference at Columbia University, we're going to launch this coalition in person. And it's extremely exciting. I think the goals of that coalition are twofold. First, we want to bring these communities together. We want Elliot to be able to meet community leaders from El Bosque in Mexico. Every community that's facing this challenge seems to feel like they're the first ones grappling with this. They didn't know governments in the Pacific, like Fiji and the Solomon Islands, have already developed national policies. They've already developed trust funds. How do we bring all those diverse stakeholders together to exchange lessons about what it means to protect their own rights in this context? And second, we want to jointly strategize around how we get those principles, non-discrimination, right to self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, into national policies on these issues. And we have a bunch of sessions, which I'd be happy to talk more about, planned at that coalition convening, and we're really excited. This is just the beginning. I think there's a lot more work to do over time, and we have a long-term advocacy strategy for how to build this work in coalition with others over time.
Just to add just a little story, when we started thinking of this coalition event a long time ago, and we thought that the main challenge would be to bring those people. It's expensive. We are bringing people from Fiji. We are bringing people from South America. And so, yeah, funding was a big thing. Like, of course, you have to fund the trip of all these community leaders. That is the core of what we do in EHR, like Environment and Human Rights Division, like working with communities in every level, and every work that we do is very important, so it was important to have them. So that was the challenge to begin with, but then Trump came, and we were very, very afraid. We're still trying to send guidelines for these people, but we are happy to say that all their visa were approved. So they're coming, we are doing it. We'll have around 40 people in New York at our office. Many of them community leaders who never left their countries. So it's going to be, it will work out, but of course that became the challenge after we began thinking of this as a part of our strategy, advocacy including, because the best way to do the advocacy internally is to do in partnership with people who are living in these places, right?
Maria Laura, when is that? When are they coming?
19th and 20th of June.
I think this is a really important and complex question that you're raising, and I'm really glad that you're addressing it. I think that the biggest awareness is going to come when some of the big cities, particularly like Jakarta, as they're affected or they're being affected right now, and people are moving, industries or governments moving. This is really a big, huge issue. And I think if the best thing I would say would be to get some people that aren't Aboriginal communities, being aware that it's not just them, it's us.
I think that's such an important perspective. We saw what happens when you move Walande, which is the community in the Solomon Islands. That's 800 people. We saw what happens when you move Gardisugdeb. That's 1,500 people. We're talking about San Luis. That's 15,000. What happens when you think about a city the size of Jakarta? That's millions of people. To my understanding right now, it's the government centers. It's like a political move. There's no effort to actually move the communities themselves to the new location. So what's going to happen to all of the people when the center of power has left and all the resources have left? I don't believe there's adequate plans for it. And all the jobs have left. I mean, this is just another case to illustrate how human rights principles are so essential, and when you don't have a human rights perspective in the governance of these kinds of relocations, really tragic outcomes occur.
This is such important work. Probably this is the most important work I think that human rights can do, because there is such a vacuum that you have to be filled with some sort of regulation. And touching on what's already been said, the scale of this is going to jump when cities like Miami and New York City and cities in Great Britain will have, as far as I can understand, no way of understanding how these changes are going to be managed. And you have entire countries like the US, which is just refusing to come to terms with the most elementary scientific evidence of climate change. How can they go from there to dealing with millions of people having to move somewhere? And you haven't even touched on the conflict that moving communities is going to create with those who then have to take them on. Canada's had some experience with Indigenous communities, moving them out of the way of this problem, that problem, the contamination provided by arsenic after lumbering and timbering operations. But what you're touching on is so much bigger, we can hardly begin to understand how we're going to do this. So laying the foundation for some sort of human rights way of tackling the problem is absolutely what we need to do. So thank you for that.
I have one more. Sorry. I mean, it's just completely, what's interesting to me is obviously our role should be super focused on the most marginalized because they don't have a voice. But I just look at my own community in Los Angeles and the huge conversation that is going on there because of the complete obliteration of two large communities of much more well-off people, but definitely this is related to climate, these huge fires. And I also worry that unless we lay the groundwork, that, you know, the more wealthy communities that are destroyed by climate change will have the biggest, you know, voices in the room and pull the most of the resources. And so I feel like there should be some kind of global fund for, you know, more marginalized communities and challenged communities to be able to draw from in coming up with their solutions.
Absolutely. There are efforts to develop funds through the UNFCCC. So through the climate change negotiations, there's an adaptation fund, there's a fund for loss and damage that's emerging. There's a green climate fund. But the problem is that communities like Gardi Sugdub, communities like Walande, where we were working in the Solomon Islands, don't have access to those funds. You need a PhD to be able to fill out the applications. They're so complicated.
Which entity or organization organizes those funds?
So it's organized by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're often administered by a bank, so like the World Bank, for instance. They're also channeled through governments. So ultimately, it's the Minister of Environment in Panama, the Minister of Environment in Solomon Islands, who's responsible for actually deciding which communities get access. And one of the things we heard loud and clear in Gardi Sugdub, but also in Walande, is we need direct access to that fund. How do we ensure direct access modalities? How do we take down some of those barriers? Some of the recent advocacy work that we were doing in Australia just this past month involved going to DFAT, the Australia version of USAID, and speaking to the leaders of those funds for the Pacific to make the case for why communities need direct access in this context. And there's some emerging discussions. They're trying to create new alternative models, but it's too little, and it's I don't want to say it's too late, but there's need for a lot more attention to this particular challenge because these relocations are so complicated. It's so expensive. Yeah.
No, it's also the challenge of getting enough money. Like there is no, like there are these funds, but if you think about it, the size of the challenge, they are not enough at all. And there has been, of course, lots of efforts, especially from countries in the global south, to make sure that climate finance for adaptation is higher. Like we are not discussing how much and how much, but it's definitely a fact that it's not enough. So maybe when we have wealthier communities also suffering, maybe we have a chance there in terms of changing the narratives. It's not only affecting the vulnerable, it's affecting everyone. But of course, these are much less prepared or supported to have their rights respected in the way. And the final thing I want to say is, we have a challenge. We are working on case studies. We are trying to have different examples on how different countries can deal with it. But we are looking for also champions, right? And that's why it was one of the strategies to go to Panama. Panama has many other communities in the same situation, and if they are able to put in place a good policy that respects the rights of these people to be consulted and talk about decide on their future, others can do too, other countries in the region. The same thing with the Pacific, and so we are hoping that by example we can move a lot of other countries to do it.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, have you engaged Maya Motley from Barbados? She has a huge voice on this topic, and she's at international climate forums all the time. And I was just wondering if you've bounced off of her at any point, because I could get to her.
I would love that. Okay. I met her once and presented to her when I was doing my doctoral research many years ago, but I am so inspired by her and would absolutely love to be connected.
Do you want to say? I'm sorry. Final question before we wrap up. Anyone?
Do you want to say something about the VR experience?
Yes, absolutely. By a show of hands, how many of you had the chance to see the VR production, or the prototype of the Solomon Islands production? No? The short one. Yeah? Okay, well, if you haven't yet had the chance, there's still a little window. Is that correct, Felix?
Yeah, we're going into a 30-minute break before we reconvene at 11:45 in Concert Hall. So this is the chance. It's one level down. It's a 2-minute thing. It's super cool.
It's going to be a long line now.
Extremely
probably.
Exciting.
I'm trying to do Ukraine also.
Yeah. Mr. Lee, Teacher Lee, yeah.
I'll just say that we need all the tools in this toolkit. These challenges are so dire, to your point earlier. The scale is so enormous, and we hope that by focusing on using this new technology to advance this work in these issues, we can accelerate attention from different sets of stakeholders who might not otherwise engage with this work, and also show people who've never been to the Solomon Islands or to Panama what it's like to be the last person standing on an island that might soon disappear because of sea level rise. And we really hope that that deeply human experience will galvanize people to take this issue seriously in a new way. And we need all hands on deck, everyone in this room. We need to have these conversations at our dinner tables about what we will do in our own communities to prepare, and how we can better push our governments to develop national policies and approaches that protect people's rights in these contexts. Because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body of climate scientists, says very, very clearly these challenges are only going to increase with time. More and more communities will be grappling with whether to plan relocations and how to plan relocations over time. And now is the time to get it right, to create that blueprint. One of the quotes that's really stuck with me from this work was from the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands almost a decade ago. He said, to fail to plan is to plan to fail. And I think that's so true when it comes to integrating human rights principles in this context.
A quick word, because I see Summer here and Juanita. So, as I said, we made climate relocation displacement a pillar of our global strategy. So the whole organization is really committed to advance on that. So we couldn't do the work in Panama if it wasn't for the partnership with the Americas Division. And I'm very happy to say that DRD is leading this project on the Philippines, in which we will see how these projects, when they are not well done, they affect vulnerable population or people in already marginalized situation, like people with disability, women. And so thank you guys too.
Thank you so much.